Do you like to wear a band around your knees during squats and hip thrusts? Maybe you've been told it's ineffective, you've been shamed on social media, and you quit doing so? Well, I'm Bret Contreras, PhD, personal trainer of 28 years, CSCS, and I'm here to tell you that it is okay to do so. At the moment, wearing a band around your knees is evidence-based. Yes, you heard that right. According to the research, you should probably be wearing a band around your knees if your goal is to maximize your glute size. In this video, I'm going to go through the evidence. There's 6 applicable studies, so I'm going to roll through those. Then I'm going to tell you why I think that knee bands, booty bands, get a lot of hate in the industry. And I'm going to wrap things up with what future research needs to look at in order to have a better understanding on this topic. Part 1, the existing body of evidence. So currently there are 6 studies worth mentioning involving mini bands, glute loops pertaining to glute. Now 5 of them involve squats and 1 of them involves hip thrusts and glute bridges. Now let's talk about what research we don't have. We have no studies examining adductor EMG activity to determine whether adductor involvement reduces when you put a band around your knees, and that's important to know. And finally, we have no hypertrophy studies, no longitudinal training studies examining actual glute hypertrophy, actual glute growth, looking at glute size before and after a training intervention, because after all, that's what we're interested in, glute hypertrophy. So when you're in this situation and you have 0 evidence looking at actual hypertrophy, then we have to go down the list of mechanistic research and form our argument using biomechanical rationale. Unfortunately, that's the best we can do. So let's dive into the 6th study. The first study is titled Sex Difference in Lower Limb Electromyography and Kinematics when Using Resistance Bands During a Barbell Back Squat. This experiment looked at trained individuals. They had them squat with a 5-rep max. They did 3 reps of a 5-rep max using 3 different progressively stronger bands around the knees. Now, as you can see in this chart, glute medius activity significantly increased. Now, glute max activity looks like it slightly increased as well, but quad and hamstring activity was unchanged. And unfortunately, they didn't look at adductor. So let's move on to the next study. This one was titled Looped Elastic Resistance During Squats. How do band position and stiffness affect myoelectric activity? Now, this study didn't use loaded squats. It looked at body weight squats, so there was no load, no barbell on the back, but they did use 3 strengths of bands, so lighter, moderate, and heavy. And what you'll see here is as the band tension increased, glute medius and glute maximus increased. And it looks like women activate the glutes even higher than men do when using bands around the knees. So let's dive into the next study. This one is titled Looped Band Placed Around Thighs Increases EMG of Gluteal Muscles Without Hindering Performance During Squatting. Now, in my opinion, this is the second most important study on this topic. It took advanced lifters. They performed back squats with 80% of their 1-rep maximum, in addition to reps to failure with 60% of 1-rep max. So 2 different tasks, 5 reps of 80% of 1RM, and then 60% of 1RM to failure. So what you'll see is the bands significantly increased glute medius and glute maximus activity, and it did so without hindering squat performance. Now, I would think, especially with advanced lifters, like if I put a band around my knees and squatted with 60% of 1RM, so if you can squat 500 pounds, picture squatting 300 pounds for max reps, how can putting a band around your knees not reduce the reps you perform? But in this study, it didn't. In fact, the group wearing the band around their knees got 1 more rep. So it not only didn't hinder performance, the group wearing the band around their knees got 1 more rep. So in this study, it would be pretty apparent if you got 1 more rep and all those reps had increased glute activation, how could that not lead to greater glute growth? Glute activation went up even more with the lighter load group. In fact, you see a 20% increase in glute activation wearing the bands during the 60% of 1-rep max squat. To me, that sounds pretty promising for the banded group. Again, this wasn't a training study. It didn't measure glute hypertrophy, but all we can do is go off biomechanical rationale. This study is definitely 2 thumbs up for the banded group. Now I'm going to discuss what I feel is the most important study on this topic. This was conducted by Kennedy, published in 2023. The title is Effects of Band-Resisted Abduction on Muscle Activity Between the Barbell Hip Thrust and Barbell Glute Bridge. So this study also looked at trained lifters. They did 5-rep max hip thrusts and glute bridges. So these are really heavy hip thrusts and glute bridges. I would like to see another study using lighter loads because this is heavy hip thrusting and glute bridging. What I love about this study, Kennedy, the main researcher, he utilized a BC strength glute loop in the study. So it was really cool. They used a large, extra large regular, which I think was the perfect call for trained male lifters. And it was really cool because they used the cue break the band. I'm going to start using that in my training. Now they did say break the band at the top of the rep. I would love to see a future study look at break the band at the bottom of a rep, which I'll explain later. Now let's talk about this study's findings. They did show that trained subjects were around 10% weaker when putting the bands around the knees. So creating simultaneous hip abduction torque reduces the weight you can use during hip extension. However, with the lighter loads, it was not accompanied by reduced EMG activity of the glutes. In fact, the lower glute max was the same lower glute max activity when using the bands, even with 10% lighter loads. But upper glute max activity was higher. And interestingly, glute medius activity was lower. So this study shows that with hip thrusts and glute bridges, you don't wear a band to increase glute medius activity. Even though the cue was break the bands at the top, that's frontal plane hip abduction. You'd think you'd be pushing out of the top maximally, and that would be carried out by the glute medius and minimus. That was not reflected in the study. You got reduced glute medius EMG activity, but you got increased upper gluteus maximus activity, which could be a big deal. So if you have the same range of motion, the same form, same stretch on the muscle, in this case the glutes, and you have more activation in one scenario versus the other, one would think that has to lead to more hypertrophy. If all else is held constant, the variation with the greater EMG activity should lead to more hypertrophy. We need a hypertrophy study to examine that. Now, the researchers didn't look at adductor EMG activity, but they did propose that it would probably reduce. And if that does in fact happen, that's a big deal. Because for people trying to grow their glutes without growing their legs, this would be a game changer, or at least a wise and valuable strategy. And although 10% load reduction isn't that big of a deal, that equates to 50 pounds if you're hip thrusting around 500 pounds. That is less pressure on the hips, which can become a problem for a lot of my female clients. So if you get bruised up, you'll take every little bit of load reduction you can if it's not going to compromise glute activity. Two more studies, not that valuable, but I'm going to mention them. This one's called Effects of a Band Loop on Lower Extremity Muscle Activity and Kinematics During the Barbell Squat. So this study looked at trained and untrained individuals. It had them do bodyweight squats and 3-rep max squats with and without loops around their knees. Now, in general, wearing a band increased glute activation, and it didn't impact performance. It didn't cause them to use reduced loading. Just like the other study I mentioned, it did not negatively impact squat performance, and also didn't impact the knee width. So the knees did not cave in when using the band. And then the final study I'm going to discuss, the title is Barbell Back Squat: How do resistance bands affect muscle activation and knee kinematics? This looked at semi-trained participants. They squatted with 40% of 1-rep max and 80% of 1-rep max, and they used 2 different strengths of bands. Now I want to look at the lighter load, the 40% load. The glute activation went up 25% when using the stronger bands, and that's huge. That's a big difference. But the bands did cause greater knee valgus. They caused the knees to cave in a little bit more. Some people believe that could impair squat technique over time, but even when the knees cave in a little bit, because the bands are super strong, it still increases glute activation. And here's an example to check out. You can see in the middle there is no resistance. At the bottom is the EMG signal with light resistance, and at the top is the EMG signal with heavy resistance. All right, now we're going to dive into part 2, why all the hate? Why do booty bands get such a bad rap in our industry?
Hey, if you're trying to build an absolute dump truck of a rear end, these things don't do shit.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
I believe that this hate comes from 5 different reasons, which I'll touch upon briefly. The first is this newer fallacy. Hardcore lifters, they like to think that their way is best, the way they learned is best, nothing new will ever be good, everything new that comes out is just a fad. You know these types, old school is best, and while I get it, I look at the way bodybuilders trained back in the 90s, I look at the way Arnold trained, it's still amazing to this day, but we do get better. Case in point, look at the glute evolution I've created. When I brought hip thrusts onto the scene and all the glute bridge and hip thrust variations, now look at all the plate loaded and selectorized hip thrust machines that are cropping up in gyms all over, and you see much greater glute development. It used to be very rare to see someone with really nice glutes in the gym. Now it's very common. Glute training has absolutely gotten way better throughout the decades, but I do get it. Hardcore meatheads don't like new things, and bands are new, and so people automatically assume that they're silly. The second reason is because they involve glutes and women. Glutes are still a taboo topic in male bodybuilding. It's bizarre. If you follow me on Instagram, I typically call out male bodybuilders for bashing hip thrusts and saying things like, if you do hip thrusts and you're a man, you should be very embarrassed. And who wants to, hump the air doing hip thrusts? Or if you do hip thrusts and you're a man, take your tampon out.
Guys train glutes as hard as they train glutes.
Never did. It's like it. To me, I got into bodybuilding like I want Tom Platzer's legs. I want this guy's arms. I never said, oh, I want that guy's ass.
All right, Chris, we've got approval for that, because let me tell you,
do.
Are we going to be okay to put that one up as a short?
Yes, you can. Yes.
Okay, Chris,
if you're doing hip thrusters and you're a man, go change your tank.
Like those are things heard even in 2025. You notice the muscle magazines, they never talk about glutes. I have a book from 1924. They didn't talk about glutes. Now it's 101 years later and they still don't talk about glutes. It's always been this way in male bodybuilding, and female physique training circles are all about the glute. It's this strange opposite world, but also bodybuilding has a lot of male chauvinists and a lot of Dunning-Kruger effect. A lot of bullies are attracted to bodybuilding, and these guys bully and they mansplain and they assume that women in the gym are just so flighty and they couldn't possibly figure out a better method than what they do in the gym. And it's so bizarre because they will tell you to train legs 1 day a week and just do squats and don't ever use bands and don't do kickbacks and don't do hip thrusts. And they'll tell you to train the way they do, which they decided to look at the human body and say, I'm gonna break up the upper body into 4 or 5 different days. I'm gonna do all lower body together in one session. Well, a woman might look at the human body and go, I'm gonna do all upper body in one session and break the lower body up into several different sessions. If you're training glutes and legs 3 days a week, you're on the right track. Do not listen to men. They do not care about glute development the way you do. They will typically give you terrible advice for glute building. Most of them have never done a single set of hip thrusts. They've never done a cable kickback. They've never done the seated hip abduction machine. They've never put a booty band on and done a set of abduction or kickbacks. They are not the experts on this matter. Women are. So they have massive Dunning-Kruger effect. They will give bizarrely hypocritical advice like, don't isolate the glutes. And then I wish I could be the woman in this situation. And some meathead said, quit doing that silly exercise. I'd say, why? Well, just squat. Well, why? This isolates the glutes. You don't need to do isolation work for the glutes. Oh, really? Do you do pec deck? Do you do flies? Yeah. Do you do curls for your biceps? Yeah. Do you do tricep extension for your triceps? Do you do side delt work? Yeah. You do calf raises? Yeah. You do leg extension, leg curls? Yeah. You do shrugs? You do lat prayers? So what you're telling me, it's good to isolate every single muscle in the body except the glutes. And then I'd just be like, you're so stupid, I can't even take you seriously. Bye-bye. But women are too nice in the gym. Probably a good thing that doesn't happen. But I do wish women could be more assertive and let the silly bro know how hypocritical his advice is. All right, moving on to point number 3. Bands work the squeeze. There's a large body of evidence. I have every single study. I'm actually preparing for a presentation on this topic. In general, exercises that work you in the stretch position are more effective at growing muscle. So a lot of this research has emerged on different body parts, but the problem is not all studies show this. There's more nuance, and with glutes, we don't know yet. Right now we have the Plotkin 2023 study showing that hip thrusts and squats tied for glute growth. Hip thrusts work you more in the squeeze, squats more in the stretch. So these bands don't work you in the stretch and they work you all in the squeeze. So they're looked at as a bad thing, as something that's gonna be very ineffective for glute growth. Here's the deal. During the COVID quarantine, my girls were calling me, telling me my upper glutes are growing. You know, I think I'm building my upper glutes because they're using their glute loops every single day. They're bored to death. They're doing all the band standing hip abduction. They're doing their glute medius kickbacks with the band. They're doing kickbacks. They're doing abduction and kickbacks from all the different angles. And their upper glutes are growing. So if the bands cause you to train at home, or let's say you get to the end of your leg work and you're like, I am tired, I don't want to wait for the cable column, I'm out of here, you skip your hip abduction work, then these bands are going to be a great thing. And do 3 sets of 20 band standing hip abductions and tell me it doesn't light up your upper glutes, your glute medius. Like, I've had big bodybuilding bros do that, and it's so funny. If you can get a big bodybuilding bro to do this, he will be sold. The problem is they won't do it. They won't even put a band on and try it, but that does not stop them from forming an opinion about it. It's bizarre. And with bands, you can do so much volume because these exercises virtually create minimal to zero muscle damage. If you're willing to train every day, you could do bands almost every day and see great results because you don't have to use any of the body's energy resources for repair. It all goes towards hypertrophy. It might be less efficient, but if you're willing to put in the work, it is effective. Now, next up, we've got the constrained neuromuscular duality hypothesis. Now, I made that term up. It sounds great, doesn't it? This theory was created by Coach Chasm Hansen. It's very logical. And I do think there's a little bit of truth to it, which I'll explain later. And what he said was that your brain, your nervous system, is not going to be able to create maximum hip abduction torque and hip extension torque at the same time. Too complicated. It's going to toggle between the two tests, and what you're left with is going to be submaximal hip abduction and submaximal hip extension torque. They're going to fight against each other, and you're better off doing each joint action individually. If you want to grow the glutes, just do hip thrust without a band. If you want to hit the glute medius, then just do band standing hip abductions or glute medius kickbacks, whatever. But that's not evidence-based. The research does not support that currently, and I'll dive into that more in a minute. And the last explanation is the scarcity mindset. When people assume others are making a lot of money, it gets them very angry. They get very jealous. For example, in my situation, Bret Contreras owns BC Strength. He sells glute loops. He's making a killing on these, so I'm going to bash them because I don't like Bret Contreras making money. Or they're just distrustful of any science pertaining to a product that you can purchase because they suspect fraud or bias. And I understand that because that does exist in our industry. I mean, you can see ads that are so silly, it's embarrassing. But every once in a while, the science is legit. The equipment companies aren't just trying to sell you product. The researchers investigating the topic are not paid off, they're not biased, they're not getting kickbacks. So I talked about the 5 different reasons, but I'm going to dive a little bit more into this constrained neuromuscular duality hypothesis because it's the most interesting. So the theory goes like this. When you're doing like a maximum squat, you're squatting to failure, you're doing a maximum load, you need all your focus to go on hip extension. If you're also pushing outwards while pushing upwards, the neural drive has to be divided, right? Like that does make sense. But the glute max is very interesting, okay? So the upper fibers are more abductors in the frontal plane, right? But what happens when you lean forward or sink down towards the bottom of the squat? Now the middle and lower fibers are in a better position to produce abduction torque. So they're producing abduction torque in the transverse plane. Like if you're doing a leaning seated hip abduction, it makes sense that more of the bulk of the glute max is going to carry out hip abduction. And when you do a squat or a hip thrust, the hip moves through a large range of motion. Okay, so when you're at the top of a hip thrust and you push out, theoretically that would target the glute medius. But the Kennedy study showed that that did not in fact take place. When you're at the bottom of a squat or a hip thrust in deep hip flexion, you can't send a lot of neural drive to the glutes. For some reason we don't understand yet. It could be related to the neuromechanical matching principle. Some evidence shows that the adductor magnus has the best leverage in deep hip flexion, whereas the glute max has the best leverage in full hip extension. So this theory would imply that in the bottom of a squat, the brain, the central nervous system, is going to prioritize sending its drive to the adductors. It's going to limit what it sends to the glute max because the glute max doesn't have good leverage there. It can't produce a ton of meaningful torque in that position. And then as you rise up, the glute max gets more and more involved. And when you reach full hip extension, the neural drive to the adductors has diminished a lot, and the neural drive to the glutes is maximized, for example, at the top of the hip thrust. And there is some good evidence to support this principle, but it could also be some sort of protective mechanism or some reflex we don't quite understand yet. There are other muscles that don't get activated well in the stretch position. For example, the erector spinae. In fact, there's a phenomenon called the lumbar flexion relaxation phenomenon to explain this. You're still creating torque, but it's passive torque. It's generated by the elastic force, just stretching of the muscle without it being activated. Still produces torque, but it's probably going to limit the hypertrophy stimulus because for maximum hypertrophy to occur, you would want maximum activation in the stretch. Theoretically, that's going to signal tighten and maybe some other mechanoreceptors to drive the hypertrophy. So when a muscle is not activated, tighten is not going to do its thing. It's probably not going to be connected to actin. It's not going to get as much stretch, so that's going to be less signaling. So a couple of years ago, I did a really cool experiment. I don't know why I didn't publish it. I took 13 highly trained lifters, very strong women from my glute squad. What I had them do is they got down to the bottom of a squat, okay? Now, I could have used the Smith machine, but I knew that people are so silly, they would have said, well, that's on a Smith machine. So I used a barbell, but it's not moving. I load it with such heavy weight that they can't move it. So yeah, it would have been the same in the Smith machine, but I just knew people would be like, they wouldn't be able to understand it's the same thing. So I had my squad members get to the bottom of the squat as deep as they could go without rounding their low back, and they pushed up as hard as they can. Now, from that exact same position, I blocked their knees on both sides, and I had them in that same bottom squat position push out as hard as they can. I also had them get on the seated hip abduction machine and mimic their squat posture. same angle of hip flexion, same knee width and level of hip abduction. Now I had electrodes on their glute medius and then also their upper, middle, and lower gluteus maximus. And what I found was at the bottom of the squat pushing upwards, you got very low levels of gluteal activation. As soon as you stopped trying to push upwards and instead pushed outwards as hard as you can, same muscle lengths, same joint angles, same muscle lengths, same level of stretch, glute activation soared, doubled or tripled in all of the regions, lower glute max, middle glute max, upper glute max, and glute medius. And on the seated hip abduction machine, the glute activation at all 4 positions was nearly identical. So for this reason, I hypothesized that wearing a band around the knees, but only focus on driving out at the very bottom, could be very beneficial because that's the point where you get the most stretch. So more activation with the same stretch should lead to greater hypertrophy. I've done other EMG experiments on myself where I get down to the bottom of a squat and I cave my knees in and I try to consciously activate my glutes as hard as I can. I can't even get to 10% of max glute activation, but then when you stand up and get your preferred stance, for me it's a little abducted, feet turned out a little bit, and squeeze your glutes from a standing position as hard as you can. You'll feel your feet turning out, you'll feel your pelvis posterior tilt, and you will literally get like 12 times higher glute activation from that position. And since there's research showing that you can grow a muscle by just stretching it passively, and you can also grow a muscle by just putting electrodes and using electric muscle stimulation, so stretch is just passive with no activation, and electric muscle stimulation, EMS, is just activation with no stretch. So since muscle can grow both ways, I believe there are at least 2 different mechanisms of tension-driven hypertrophy, one that's active in nature and one that's passive in nature. So I'd love to see an EMG hip thrust study using a little bit lighter loads than a 5-rep max, maybe like a 12 RM, and then with the cue of break the band when you reach the bottom of the movement. I think you'd see an even greater difference of glute max activation compared to the no band condition. And this could theoretically maximize glute hypertrophy while simultaneously minimizing adductor activity and hypertrophy. But this is all theoretical. We need experiments, we need hypertrophy research. At this point, there is a logical basis for it though. And what we need to figure out is what is the right combination of hip extension load versus hip abduction load, meaning what load to put on the back during squats, what load to put on the hips during hip thrusts or glute bridges, in combination of what band tension, not just what size band, like the circumference of the band, but also the strength. And it could vary depending on the exercise. Obviously, it varies depending on the lifter and their anatomy, but the EMG results could be affected by the cue, the experience of the lifter, the barbell load, the strength of the band, and the effort, the proximity to failure. So I hope this video inspires researchers to take more look at that, because I'd love to see more studies. So I made this chart to summarize the research, and I'll leave this up. So when you wear bands around the knees during various hip extension exercises, you can see with the hip thrust, it does tend to decrease your performance by around 10%. You get 10% less load. Maybe if you use the same loads, you'll get, a couple reps reduced. Glute medius activity decreases with hip thrusts and glute bridges, but gluteus maximus activity increases, especially in the upper glute max, with no change in quad activity, no change in hamstring activity, and adductor activity was not measured. It hasn't been measured in any studies. Now, just an interesting observation, with the glute bridge, hamstring activity was slightly reduced while wearing the band around the knees, but it did not reach significance. So I'd like to look into that more. With back squats, you'd think that you'd see a change in performance. You'd think it would reduce performance, but all in all, based on the research, it looks like there's no change. Now let's discuss this. When you do squats with a band, you're not trying to break the band. You're not creating maximum abduction torque. What you tend to do is just make sure the knees don't cave in. But you're not trying to maximize abduction with or trying to break the band. When you do hip thrusts and glute bridges though, you are trying to maximize abduction torque. You are trying to break the bands. So that's why I think it doesn't impair performance with squats the way it does with hip thrusts and glute bridges. But I do want to say some studies show a slight decrement with squats, some no change at all, and one study even showed performance benefit, a boost of 1 more rep with the group that wore the band. With back squats, you tend to see an increase in glute medius activation, which is opposite of what you see with hip thrusts and glute bridges, with no change in quad and hamstring activity, and once again, adductor activity was not measured. And finally, I just want to mention Deadlifts and leg presses, there's no research on them. Deadlifts, people might assume, well, why would you wear a band during deadlifts? You're never pushing the knees out during a deadlift variation, except with sumo, but you couldn't wear a band during sumo variations. It would have to be so big around, but it also would interfere with the arm path. But here's the deal. You could wear a strong band and push out without really abducting the knees, and it could theoretically slightly increase glute activation, and it could possibly slightly reduce adductor activation, which would be desirable with many females seeking to grow their glutes without growing their legs. Now I'm going to put a picture of the glutes up here. The glute medius and minimus are very similar in shape and fiber direction. The glute medius is just bigger, but those mainly produce frontal plane hip abduction. Now I do think if you do like a seated hip abduction at a 90-degree angle, the posterior fibers would be activated. Seeking maximum glute medius and minimus growth, you want to do a variety of hip abduction movements, but the upper gluteus maximus and lower gluteus maximus clearly have a unique, distinct neural strategy. The upper glute max does not activate the same way that the lower glute max does. Now, the upper glute max appears to be better suited for frontal plane hip abduction. In fact, when you do frontal plane hip abduction, you'll get upper glute max activation. You won't get any lower glute max activation. Now, the upper fibers of the gluteus maximus are going to produce hip extension, frontal plane hip abduction, transverse plane hip abduction, hip external rotation, and posterior pelvic tilt. The lower glute max fibers are going to produce all the same actions except frontal plane hip abduction. But the lower fibers appear to be better suited for hip extension, and the upper fibers appear to be better suited for abduction and posterior pelvic tilt. Again, we need more research on this. The only study looking at upper versus lower gluteus maximus growth was the Plotkin 2023 study, and it did not match EMG activity. You got higher gluteus maximus EMG activity with the hip thrust, especially in the upper subdivision, but hip thrusts and squats generated the same level of glute max hypertrophy in the upper and lower subdivisions, so we definitely need more research on the topic. And now I'm going to wrap up with directions for future research, what we need to know. As I said earlier, in the absence of longitudinal training studies measuring glute hypertrophy, all we can go by is biomechanical rationale. These are mechanistic studies investigating things like EMG activity, muscle stretch, things like that. So in order to be more confident and form a better opinion on this topic, we need more EMG studies. I'd like to see, for example, hip thrust studies looking at different cues. The top of the hip thrust versus the bottom of the hip thrust. When you use a band during hip thrust, you can just kind of keep pressure the entire time and not really go crazy with the abduction torque. It's really hard to keep pushing out on the way up and down throughout the entire set. So I think a better strategy is to focus on a particular phase. For example, the top of the rep or the bottom of the rep or the concentric rising portion or the eccentric lowering portion. As I said earlier, I think if you cue them to push out as hard as possible on the way down, trying to break the band as you get to the very bottom of the movement, I think that would be the best strategy for maximizing glute EMG activity and glute growth. We need to know that. We need to look at hip thrusts with a variety of loads. All we have right now is a 5RM. We need to look at lighter loads. We need to look at adductor EMG activity during hip extension tasks while wearing a band, because it might reduce, and if so, that's huge. We need studies looking at leg presses and deadlifts. We need to look at regional glute growth, upper versus lower glute max activity to see if bands preferentially grow the upper glute max. So I've mentioned the future research throughout this whole video. I'm not going to go more into that, so I'll just wrap this video up with a summary. So in conclusion, right now the evidence supports wearing bands around the knees during hip extension exercises. Knee bands reduce hip thrust and glute bridge strength by around 10%. Even with the slighter loads during thrusts and bridges, knee bands increase upper glute max activation and match lower glute max activation. Knee bands increase glute max activity during squats in addition to glute medius activity even when the knees cave in a bit. Knee bands should not be worn for the glute medius during hip thrust. They should be worn for the upper glute max as they decrease glute medius activity. Separate glute exercises should be performed to train the glute medius, such as glute medius kickbacks or glute medius hip thrust. Wearing bands during hip extension exercises is done for the glute max, not for the glute med. We currently don't know if knee bands reduce adductor EMG activity and hypertrophy during squats, hip thrusts, etc. Knee bands do not appear to reduce squat performance. Yes, I find this hard to believe, but 2 studies show this on trained subjects. More activation plus same range of motion, which is the same stretch, should equal more growth. We need hypertrophy studies to verify this. There are currently no hypertrophy studies involving knee bands during hip extension exercises, so we must rely on biomechanical rationale. The constrained duality hypothesis popularized by Coach Chasm, despite being very logical, currently lacks support from a theoretical hypertrophic perspective, but it does have support from a strength and force perspective. Knee bands do not impact quad or hamstring EMG activity during squats or thrust. Interestingly, hamstring activity is slightly reduced during bridges, but not significant. And we currently don't know if knee bands increase glute activity during deadlifts or leg press. And the last and final statement, right now, until a hypertrophy study is published, knee bands during hip extension exercise should be recommended for those who 1. Train glutes frequently for variety's sake, 2. Seek to grow their glutes without growing their legs, and 3. Prefer lighter loads or feel markedly better when using them. So in conclusion, I'm open-minded to a study emerging down the road saying that knee bands did not lead to more hypertrophy, but we don't know that right now. We do have greater EMG activity with the same form and the same range of motion. That should lead to more glute growth. So if you like wearing the bands, block out the bros and keep on thrusting. And if you're a researcher who's interested in this line of research, please contact me. I'd love to be involved. That's a wrap. I'm Bret Contreras, AKA the Glute Guy. If you found this video interesting, please make sure to hit like. Definitely leave me a comment. Let me know how I'm doing. And please subscribe to my channel if you like talking about glutes, if you like strength training and hypertrophy science, because that's what I'm all about in 2025. I plan on releasing a video every 5 to 7 days. Thank you for watching.